الأزمة الكل معك، كمل حلمك وابني فلسطين. وبكرة الأزمة بننساها وبتعدي، والتحي الحلوة حنشوفها أكيد. نحاول روق وهدي أيام الحلوة حنرجع.
في الجلسة القادمة سيتم نقاش وتفحص منصات الذكاء الاصطناعي التوليدي واستعراض المشاكل الأخلاقية والمخاطر المحتملة، لا سيما عندما يتعلق الأمر بتعزيز الذكاء الاصطناعي للصور النمطية السلبية. يستعرض المتحدثون كيف أحدثت أدوات الذكاء الاصطناعي التوليدي ضرراً بالشعب الفلسطيني والمجتمعات المهمشة الأخرى من خلال التطبيق غير المسؤول، وكيف يمكن أن تساعدنا تكتيكات الذكاء الاصطناعي الأخلاقية والقابلة للتفسير في تجنب هذا الضرر في المستقبل. أرحب الآن في الأستاذة منى الجتي، مديرة الحملات والشركات للشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا ومسؤولة التواصل مع الشركات في ديجيتال أكشن. وأرحب أيضا بالفنانة والكاتبة أميرة كعوش، والباحثة ومتعددة التخصصات رضا قادري، وستدير الجلسة الدكتورة أليكس هانا، مديرة البحوث في معهد الذكاء الاصطناعي الموزع دير. تفضلي صافي.
In the upcoming session, we'll discuss and examine generative AI platforms focusing on the ethical issues and potential risks, especially regarding AI's reinforcement of negative stereotypes. The speakers will showcase how generative AI tools have caused harm to the Palestinian people and other marginalized communities through irresponsible application. They'll also explore how ethical and interpretable AI tactics can help us avoid such harm in the future. I now welcome Munى الجتي. Munى is the Campaigns and Partnerships Manager for the Middle East and North Africa and Corporate Engagement Lead at Digital Action. I also welcome Dr. Amira Kawash, an interdisciplinary artist and writer. And lastly, Rida Kadri, an interdisciplinary scholar of AI technologies in the Global South. The session will be moderated by Dr. Alex Hanna, Director of Research at the Distributed AI Research Institute.
Hello. So happy to be here today to have this conversation with y'all. Thank you for joining, and thanks for folks who are joining around the world. This is a great panel. I'm looking forward to chatting about this, and I think I'm going to start with Amira. One thing I want to focus on is this kind of rise of AI generated images, and the way that they've been tied to kind of dehumanization of Palestinians, and much of that stems from the way that these things are trained, the way that these things are created. I want to ask you a little bit about this, about the way that these technologies have been exacerbating the dehumanization of Palestinians, and how there's been this kind of weaponization of AI, especially in the past 8 months and since October 7th.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I had prepared like a couple of slides, I think, just to show a couple of images, AI generated images, because I think that will help the audience ground and understand a bit the kind of dehumanization that we're talking about. So just please bear with me while I share my screen. There we go. Okay, view full screen. Can everyone see that? Yeah, so, here we go. Okay, so in my research, I've been looking at the ways that popular AI image generators are scaling existing anti-Palestinian bias, as well as normalizing scenes of exceptional violence. So this isn't just about outputs and how AI generated media can be manipulated, it's about how inherent baselines are working in these systems. So for example, these were images that were generated on popular AI platforms such as Adobe and Midjourney with the simple prompt, Palestinian child in a city. So what we see is that, by default, Palestinian spaces are depicted as urban wastelands, as scenes of widespread devastation, and these are, routinely replicated in popular Gen AI platforms. And this next image is, again, Palestinian person in a city. What we see is also that these images offer no historical or political context. They tend to obscure Israel's military presence there, so there is no perpetrator. It is a bit like witnessing an occupation without an occupier. And we're also seeing Gen AI weaponized, for example, here by the Prime Minister of Israel's office, who offered, these images as to what Gaza 2035 would look like according to, Zionist future high-tech futurism. You're literally seeing the weaponization of these technologies by state actors. And then one of the things I'm also considering, because I'm also an artist, is how can we dismantle these systems, and is there a way to use generative AI to express Palestinian narratives, histories, and futures? I'm thinking also about how to maybe create a artistic intervention and as a local site. It's very difficult to debias and these systems at scale, but to start creating maybe instances where they are less harmful, specifically to Palestinians, but also marginalized groups. So I'll stop sharing now. I think the digital dehumanization is built structurally into the system. It's not just about use cases. It is a structural part of the way that data, gets unethically scraped, and how Palestinians are depicted in mediascapes already, and then how that becomes generalized and automated by popular AI platforms. So.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great introduction, and I appreciate you showing those initial images to ground the discussion. I want to turn to Mona right now, and Mona, you've focused, for so much time on content moderation and the way that platforms have really failed Palestinians in content moderation. With the introduction of AI, I know a lot of the discussion of content moderation or on AI we have now is typically on generative AI, but so much of the pipeline of content moderation relies on some kind of automation. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that and the way that AI has been really weaponized against Palestinians in content moderation beyond.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And it's lovely to be joining all the great speakers on this session. So whenever we're speaking about online content, I'd like us to start speaking about something beyond the regular content moderation on social media platforms. Because with the generative AI, we are also speaking about content on different platforms such as ChatGPT, Bard, and other platforms where people are asking those platforms questions about Palestine, about Israel, about what they know about the historical context about Palestine and Israel. And the fascinating part is the technologies nowadays are exacerbating the global equity crisis. They are showing the power imbalance between the occupier and the occupied. The data sets that are used are also echoing this oppression that occupied people such as Palestinians are facing on a daily basis. At the beginning of this ongoing genocide, there was a major case where a Palestinian activist tried to ask ChatGPT about whether the Palestinians have the right to be free and whether the Israelis have the right to be free. In the case of Palestinians, ChatGPT basically said that he has no, or the application itself has no opinion, no feelings, no beliefs, and the question is very complex and controversial. And that was like a starting point for this activist to start whether the Israelis have, or the Israel has the right to be free. When that question was typed into ChatGPT, the ultimate answer that he got was yes, like all people, freedom is a fundamental human right, regardless your nationality, your ethnicity, your religion, or whatsoever. And this is like the shortened answer for both questions. This question, it was like at the beginning of this ongoing genocide, and it's very crystal clear that in such cases, in very sensitive contexts, when people are trying to shape their opinions about an ongoing genocide where over 40,000 people have lost their lives or have been killed by the Israelis in Gaza Strip, we're still struggling with tech platforms and their bias against oppressed people, which is basically echoing or exacerbating the on-the-ground oppression that we as Palestinians are struggling with on a daily basis. I don't want to repeat what has been said in the previous session, because I believe they covered the whole surveillance technology, but it's the same. This genocide is also AI-powered genocide, where people in Gaza are also murdered and killed on a daily basis based on AI technologies such as the Lavender system and the Gospel. So we are basically speaking about different systems. Sometimes it's surveillance systems, and some other times it controls the narrative. It controls what people are viewing, what people are trying to see to shape their ideas around what's going on in Palestine. When it comes to social media platforms, it's been a long battle, speaking about their machine learning systems, their biased content moderation policies against Palestinians. I know, like many people, they just heard or they started more engagement on the content moderation stuff since the beginning of this ongoing genocide, or some others started in May 2021, where also the escalations were on the ground in Palestine, in Gaza, and in Jerusalem. However, we've been speaking about the bias against the social media companies' bias against Palestinians for way longer. It started since the social media use have been utilized for activism purposes, where people are trying to mobilize and organize themselves to try to speak up about Palestine, to try to engage with other Palestinian people around the world. Since, as you may know, Palestinians are suffering fragmentation due to the historical violations or abuses against them. And one of the major cases that has labeled Palestinians, stereotyped Palestinians, and dehumanized Palestinians is the case when an Instagram user who has in his bio the word Palestinian and then the flag and then the word Alhamdulillah, which means praise to God or thanks God, and they use the automated translation for that bio, and the translation was Palestinian terrorist. If we want to think about that, if anything, this reflects the data that has been used and how the Islamophobia, how the anti-Palestinian racism are rooted in certain data sets that has been used to train such machine learning system to result in labeling Palestinians as terrorists. Being worse, looking at WhatsApp at the beginning of this, or giving a worse example, looking at WhatsApp at the beginning also of this ongoing genocide, when people were trying to look for AI generated stickers on WhatsApp, and they were looking for the word Palestinian Muslim boy, and they got a sticker for a young boy who's basically holding a gun. However, when people were looking for an Israeli boy or an Israeli soldier, they were finding a smiling soldier or a boy who's playing or learning or doing whatever he want to do. In that way, we also can get a sense on what kind of data has been used to train such AI-generated sticker system, and where is this dehumanization, labeling, and stereotyping coming from? It's not coming from out of the blue. It's not coming from the machine itself, because the machine itself is has no opinion around that. It's the data sets that reflects the human bias toward a nation, toward people over others, where this is basically a reflection of the global equity crisis. And I know we're here speaking about Palestine, but Palestine is part of the larger world, where also other people in global majority countries are also facing the same kind of stereotyping, of labeling, and of dehumanizing because of this biased data sets that is used by different tech platforms to train their systems, to result at the end of the day about to misinform people who are trying to understand what's going on in different parts of the world, or who are trying to stand in solidarity with oppressed people in those marginalized communities. I'll stop here, but I would be more than happy to elaborate on any point.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mona. That was super, super helpful. And I want to say, if folks have questions, they can put them in the chat in Ring Central. You can get to them at the end. I want to pass it to Rida now. And I know, Rida, in your research, you focus a lot on pipelines of AI development. And even though you haven't necessarily done work on Palestinian representation, you know very closely about how these representational failures emerge. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how they emerge more deeply and what kind of interventions can be made to address some of them in practice.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. This is such a wonderful conversation, and I think both Amira and Mona really set up really nicely some of the stakes of these representational failures, and also the kind of touched on a little bit about where these might come from. So I've been very interested in thinking about the ways in which sort of an outsider's view gets embedded into representations of particular communities throughout the pipeline. So data, of course, is one aspect that gets a lot of attention, but I think we also have to consider kind of all of the other elements that go into developing and deploying and designing an AI technology. So of course, there is concern about the way data is scraped, the existing biases that are skewed towards Western dominant perspectives that can scaled up. But I think there's also this other orientation towards data that exists within the broader tech community, that larger data sets can hide gaps in representativeness, or that we just need a bigger data set, or we just need more data. But what that forgets is that data, as you know, Alex, your work has also shown, data sets always have perspectives. And so there is never going to be a data set that doesn't have a perspective or that is unbiased. It'll always have a perspective from a particular community or from a particular culture. The question is just which perspective are you embedding in your model? So that's kind of one question about data. Can you ever have the perfect data set? Is the question about acknowledging perspectives in your data sets and recognizing that there are certain perspectives you have and certain perspectives that are missing? What do you do about communities that don't have digitized data or don't want to show up in your data sets? Right. So it's a very sort of complex question about what might the data level fix might be. But I think one thing to remember is that volume does not necessarily equal equitable representation. But then there are also questions of model design here. So right now, the way common generative AI models are designed is that the model is trained to return the most empirically dominant next token. So what is the most likely next word, or what is the most likely next pixel, or what is the most likely association going to be? And that by design inherently means that majoritarian and dominant perspectives will be will be returned or scaled up. So if you have a data set, let's say, you have 1,000 images of the Eiffel Tower, and you have 5 images, of the Badshahi Masjid, which is an important mosque from where I come from. And if you ask the model, like, give me an image of a landmark, because it's sort of trained to think about majority representations or empirically dominant tokens, it will most likely return what is most dominant. So this is something, there is a model level interventions here where you can train the model to think about more minoritized perspectives. Then there are also questions about deployment. Right now, as we've sort of noticed, there is not a lot of agency that's given to the user, and a lot of the way that the interface is designed, the model sort of assumes a lot of things about your prompt. So if, Amir, as you were saying a Palestinian boy, or like a Palestinian city, you have given no details, and but the model sort of assumes that it knows best, and it can assume what you wanted. Maybe you did want a particular sign of devastation, but maybe you wanted images that were diverse, that showed Palestinian joy, that showed a particular city and its geographies and its the ways in which it's used, its social life. But the model just assumed that it sort of understood your intent and created an image based on that. And then there are ways to design interfaces that give people more agency over their own representation, that kind of like create a conversation about like, oh, is this what you wanted? Like when you say Palestinian boy or Palestinian city, what do you mean? But I think like all of those things cannot happen till there is an orientation in like the broader sort of tech industry and community that there is always an engineering fix to something. In the cases of, for example, data sets having, in the case of representation, for example, creating an engineering fix that gets the right representation for the right person every time is actually impossible, because representation is so complex. What I think is a good representation would be very different from what you think is a good representation. It will always, our evaluation of representations will be based on our histories, the kind of networks of power we're embedded in, existing media that we've consumed, what our intent was, who we think the author is, how we think the media is going to be used. But right now, the way we're sort of heading towards with generative AI, we're sort of moving towards wanting to create that 5 canonical representations in response to prompts and in response to user action. But that is, that's sort of an impossible task. When we do that, we sort of will, by default, I think, keep defaulting to majoritarian and outsider perspectives. I think we have to start thinking about how do we shift agency to users, to communities, to create the representations they want, as opposed to us sort of guessing what is the representation that needs to be sent out.
Yeah, I appreciate you couching that and thinking about and pointing to this idea that data sets are always going to have a particular sort of bias, and we need to make particular sorts of value claims if we want that representation within it, right? I want to turn it on that note back to Amira, and one of the questions I have for you is, in your practice as an artist, in your practice as someone that is thinking about different kinds of representations, I guess I have sort of a 2-part question, or one is, what are there ways in which these representations, what are the ways in which they live in the world? Like how do they get interpreted as a particular form of media, and what does that do kind of on the ground? My second question is actually somewhat specific, because we talked about it. It was this AI generated image, this All Eyes on Rafah image that has been circulating for a few months now, and what that's done, and sort of its origins. In the last panel, I think Gillian York spoke a little bit about the ways in which this image was being shared as a bit of an alternative to these images of violence and death that we've seen. So many images as a way of kind of skirting that. But I'd love to just talk about the way that images are received and what AI imagery does in the case of Palestinians.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, when we're talking about representation, we should also be talking about self-representation, and also the ways in which Palestinians and other oppressed and marginalized groups have been denied the tools for self-representation. So, that exists in, there are decades of media bias, there are decades of, the discrediting of Palestinian lived experiences and narratives. So I think with representational justice, it really has to become about the having access and being empowered to use tools towards self-representation. I think with AI generated images, more generally, what they do in a long-standing representational system, which is Western dominated or global North dominated, particularly in terms of technological development, is that they provide a kind of cheap and scalable synthetic realism that can be used by a variety of different actors. And I think that blending of fiction with reality and how that plays out, that is something that is new to synthetic media, that access to have a degree of believability, and yes, I think synthetic realism is a good term for it. We don't know how that will play out, in a number of different domains. I think with the All Eyes on Rafah image, there was a lot of, it was controversial, for many reasons, but I think it's important to say that, there was also something initially, there was we need a degree of virality, and some of that was positive, you could say. I mean, when you opened your Instagram that day and you saw every single story was this AI generated image, there is something we need to affirm in that. Now, a lot of things, fell short about it. One is that it felt like another extension of digital erasure or digital dehumanization, particularly when there were so many citizen journalists, Palestinian citizen journalists on the ground doing a heroic job of documenting lived reality. And I think the wholesale discrediting of Palestinian lived experience, I think that was triggering for a lot of people who felt this AI image was kind of a stand-in or a fake to prevent, actually the world seeing us, like seeing, and then the messaging also fell short because, here we are 1 week later, all eyes on Rafah, all eyes on Rafah. Now what? It's not enough just to have, eyes. So it was criticized for kind of a sort of slacktivism, of people doing the absolute minimum that they should be doing to stop this genocidal onslaught. So so I think there are ways in which AI generated media or synthetic media plays into long-standing representational issues and mediascapes, and then there are some new kind of questions and unknown about what really does this kind of cheap and scalable synthetic realism, what is it going to do, politically in elections and representational justice, etc. So that's kind of my sketching out of that.
Yeah, I like this term synthetic realism. This is a really helpful thing, and it takes on this very particular style. And the history of this image is so curious because it kind of started in this Malaysian Facebook group where people wanted to really promote kind of AI generated images and make them recognizable. So it's really curious that this is a thing that went viral, in kind of people in the group don't really necessarily even have or may not even have the same political goals or the same kind of human rights outlook. I want to turn the question to Mona again. I want to ask a pretty similar question. When we see these things in the world, what are they doing? What kind of, and I mean, I guess the question is what kind of pathways do they close? And then what kind of pathways may they open up? And maybe a third part of that question is maybe what are some kind of emerging, I don't want to call them emerging threats, but what are some emerging dangers that might come about when we see more and more of this generative AI tooling, and whether that's images or text, kind of polluting our media landscape?
So, speaking about generative AI and AI generated content, I think we need to highlight the role of AI generated content at the beginning of this ongoing genocide in disinforming people, where some officials, some politicians have relied on generative AI to get pictures and post that online. One of those cases was the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and when he got this AI generated picture, posted that on his social media, and it was about a burnt baby, or he claimed that this is a burnt baby that Hamas committed in October 7th. However, and later on, after several investigations from different platforms, it was confirmed that this was an AI generated content where instead of this burnt body, there was a dog on this original picture. So the harm, I would call it as tech harm, because he caused tech harm. He basically used that picture to gain more support, to fuel the social media platforms, to disinform people about what's happening in this geographical area, what's going on. So he disinformed people, and then at some point it manipulated the public opinion around the Israel-Palestine case. And this is just one example of too many examples, again, not only in Palestine, but around the globe. In Digital Action, we work in this year on a big campaign. It's called Year of Democracy campaign, where over 65 elections are happening around the world, where also generative AI has been weaponized to disinform people and misinform them, causing extremism, manipulation, and sometimes contributed to spread hate speech and violent speech against certain communities in different parts of the world. So we can't start speaking about the slacktivism or the benefits of how we can mobilize using the AI or generative AI without acknowledging and speaking about the tech harm that it caused. It is contributing to the whole to the whole information disorder that we are struggling with very few resources to combat that. And even social media platforms or tech platforms, they are not investing enough resources to combat this disinformation or this information disorder. And we're still asking them about what the concrete actions or breaking glass measures that they are taking to limit or to prohibit the tech harms caused by generative AI content. So we're speaking about big topic. We're speaking about tech harms that is affecting people in the real world and is causing or is contributing to the biggest catastrophe that's happening in Gaza Strip. speaking about the other or the bright side of generative AI and the picture that Amira started speaking about, we no one can just like deny that this kind of slacktivism helped raise the awareness of people around the world to know that there is a genocide, there is a war crime committed by the Israelis in Gaza. We've seen that this was the most shared picture there on like in that week on Instagram, where also it was supported or hugely supported by different influencers, celebrities, artists around the world. But if we want to deep dive a little bit into that picture, we kind of can understand why is that happening. This picture is describing what's going on in Gaza, is alarming the bell about the genocide in Gaza without showing a lot of blood. All the dehumanization for what's going on in Gaza has unfortunately used pictures for Palestinians like in their with their blood or like the catastrophic situation unfortunately is not giving the people the privilege to think about what kind of pictures that they are posting online and how is this content that is posted online is contributed by Palestinians, is sometimes contributing to dehumanize Palestinians. So this picture was empty of blood. It was just showing destruction. It has like one big bold sentence where everyone can read it, can understand it, and can interact with it, with also showing that for different generations, because we know the age limit, the image limit or the age limit on the different social media platforms. So because it has literally no sensitive content, it was hugely distributed and published on different social media platforms. So I would say that nothing can be seen as a black and white, especially with all the emerging technologies nowadays, but without having a clear, concrete regulation for those technologies that address tech harms all over the world, not only in a certain part of the world, not only in the EU, not only in the US, but all over, because people in global majority countries are left behind. All those regulations, we are using those technologies with zero regulations, but rather sometimes our oppressive regimes are also misusing those technologies to smear political opponents, journalists, or feminists just because they disagree with them. So we need to keep that in mind, and we need to think about that before just start being fascinated about this new emerging technologies.
That's very, very helpful. I also want to remind our audience, please drop questions in the chat. We have several so far. I will start when we at the top of the hour. I'm going to pass it back to Rida to, I think because I think where you were starting was talking about how, data sets always have a perspective. And I think one question I want to pose to you as a follow-up is, I want you to explain why having more data is not a good solution, and how these technical fixes are not sufficient. But also, if we were going to approach these as socio-technical systems, what kind of interventions should we think about in approaching them? Because I think many of the developers only think about these as technical interventions. So I'd love, what kind of socio-technical interventions could be made to deal with generative AI and dehumanization?
Yeah. So I think like with generative AI, what's actually really interesting to me is how much clearer at least to me, the socio-technical has become, and how big the split is between people who kind of just think of them as technical systems, not just, and I'm saying socio-technical systems, not just because of the social impact that they will have, because, of course they are, as we've sort of talked about this, but because inherently what these are media technologies in some ways, right? They are technologies that are producing representations. You can see them as technologies of cultural production, similar to maybe, let's say, the camera in some ways. You can see them as technologies of information generation. You can see them as technologies of communication. So it really just depends on, I think, reframing these technologies slightly and thinking about what are other types of social technologies that have had social impact that we can learn from. And so if you suddenly reframe generative AI from just a generation, sort of a technical generation technology, to a media technology, I think you'll be forced to consider the kinds of impact media technologies have had in the past. You'll be forced to engage with media studies scholarship. So I think there is something about framing. Similarly with data sets. If you think of data sets as just these like technical objects where there is, like just tokens represented, or if you think about images as just pixels, or a collection, a data set of images as just a collection of pixels, or a data set of language as just a collection of tokens. I think it's easier to separate yourself. But if you think of data sets as archives, and you think of them as and you link them to what are the and people in the AI fairness space have also written about this. What happens when we start thinking about data sets as curated objects similar to archives? What are lessons that critical archiving practice can give us in terms of the fact that there is always a perspective of the curator, even if it's a human curator, that there is always going to be questions of representation embedded in these data sets, that you could have the largest data set. So one really interesting paper that I read recently was about Flickr, for example, of data sets. And a lot of the evaluations that we often do on data sets for representation, even if that happens, are on just like kind of quantitative metrics, right? Of like, oh, is like, let's say, a particular culture represented? And this paper was talking about how in Flickr, a majority of images about the African continent are basically from tourists. So that kind of, I think, brings to light how limited our even evaluation tools and techniques are for data sets. If you have, if I just look at this data set and I say, oh, there are like 50,000 images from the African continent, or depicting the African continent, and sort of our job is done, but then don't recognize that every photograph is giving a perspective of its author. That I think then, so then if you only have tourist photos in a particular data set, no matter how large the data set is, the viewpoint that you will be escalating will be a tourist's viewpoint. And as anyone who's seen tourist photographs of the cities and the communities they live in versus photographs that people who are from those communities, you sort of know what that difference is. There's also, I think, thinking about, when you think about data sets, the perspectives are not just at the like image level, let's say, but even at the labeling level. Again, something that museums and archivists have long dealt with. How do you describe an image? How do you, even something like authorship, for example, is so contested, because when you in museums, something that they're sort of dealing with now is if you take a painting and you say, okay, this painting is by Leonardo da Vinci, but in a lot of curatorial contexts, like Iran, for example, artistic traditions do not have similar kinds, just culturally similar kinds of cultures of attribution, where there's one artist, historically there's one artist and one painting. And so even that idea of author as a meta label category falls apart when we think about global data sets for global cultures. When you think about an image description, you think about describing, and so many of these generative AI technologies are learning relationships between text and visuals, which is why image descriptions become important. So if you have an image that's described, let's say take a mosque, and you say, oh, this is you could describe it as a site of worship. You could describe it as a mosque. You could describe it architecture. You could describe it social history. There's so many things that you could describe on that, and the ones that you choose the way the machine understands it. And so there are, many different ways in which perspectives enter into our data set, and just sort of scaling them up without accounting for all of these different human elements, social elements that we're adding to them. Won't fix this, just as, for example, just because the British Museum has the largest, let's say, collection of photographs about like colonial India, doesn't mean that they have all the perspectives, right? Because the perspectives of photographs that were taken by colonial administrators have a very particular perspective. And that's sort of also actually relevant because so much of generative AI culturally is learning from these existing digitized archives. So that's kind of like, how I think about it. How can we shift the way we frame these technologies and learn from histories of other historical technological interventions in our social spaces to think about paths forward? And I think that's also something that many in the tech community don't do. Like, we always think that there is this technology sort of new and it is going to have these like revolutionary consequences, whether good or bad, but so much of technology builds up on other forms of technology. And it's just a matter of finding those parallels and thinking about who are the experts in those kinds of historical, social implications of technologies that we can now learn from in this current moment.
Yeah, thank you. We have about 7 minutes left, so I want to get to some of the questions. There's one question about pedagogy. So how can we bring these discussions to more everyday, day-to-day levels? For instance, people who are not necessarily aware about how biases operate in the data sets and how they are reproduced in all the invisible operations. What might be some good educational strategies? I'll just open that up to anyone who wants to answer that.
I've been talking a lot. Amira, go ahead. I saw you were going to say something.
Yeah, I know that there's a whole sort of thing about understandable AI, just really making, the language around it more easier to understand, more, and maybe more visual as well. But I think also, I don't know if the question was also about like pedagogies of also moving forward. I really liked what Rida was saying about kind of critical archival practices and how AI is really just this other archive, and it's data-based. And, right now there is this kind of generative AI race with all the different platforms trying to scrape as much data as possible, to create a representation of our world. But I think actually thinking about how AI sits as a kind of archive with other archival practices will help frame it and maybe make it less harmful. So I think maybe that's part of its understandability, is also understanding where AI sits in archival practice more generally.
Yeah, I can quickly just jump in. I think there are, multiple types of pedagogical interventions to be taken. One is, of course, around user education. I don't know if, unfortunately, I think we're in a state where the onus or the expectation is for a lot of companies producing these technologies to do the explainability and to do the transparency. And that, of course, is incentives don't always align for that. It is also technically a hard thing to do because so many of these technologies that are being built, like even the people building them don't are able to sort of create the technical fixes for things like transparency and explainability. So it is also a hard problem. But I think there's also interventions to be made at even how we teach computing to engineers, to high school students, to undergrads. And I think the more we sort of bring in these understandings of, as Alex was saying, the socio-technical nature of these technologies earlier on, and not kind of seeing engineering practice as just a technical practice. I think we could get to a point where we're not retrofitting things like responsibility or fairness or explainability or transparency or trustworthiness or user education afterwards, but sort of it becomes something that people think about in their practice, just like someone who's building a car will always sort of think about where will the seat belts go. Someone who's building an architect who's designing a building is always taught to think about things like earthquake safety or other forms of codes of building practice. I think we sort of have to think about similarly, what does that social code for engineers look like?
Maybe I would jump in for a comment to follow up on what Rida was saying, because I do agree that the education for engineering, for engineers about the social aspect is really important. However, with the existing people who are working on emerging technologies in the different big tech, I think there is a problem on how those technology companies are responding to the different claims from civil society, from experts, from academics, to the bias that their companies are reflecting to their data sets, among other things. And from a place where I have several years engaging with tech platforms, I've noticed that there is this style of working where different teams are working in silos and there is no cross-cutting way of working. So the engineers are developing the technology and most of them are taking creativity over safety, because the nature of the startups and the big techs are encouraging more creative technologies to be produced so they can be trendy more and more. However, with the human rights team or with a public policy team or the whole regulatory framework is still lagging behind. So we do have trendy technologies, but we don't have trendy policies to address the different tech harms that those technologies are causing in our day-to-day life. So I think we need to have this kind of a cross-cutting style of work where we are breaking those silos, and all the teams can be also hearing from civil society, from experts, and from academics whenever they are criticizing those technologies, instead of just communicating whenever we are having the direct engagement with the tech platforms, with the human rights teams. Again, it might be good intention from the human rights team to engage with civil society. However, because they are not engineer, the problem is not reflected in their engineering system. And here is the big problem that we need to discuss and we need to address in our work as digital rights defenders.
I think that's a great note to end on. And I just want to say, I think leaving it with engineers is not sufficient. There needs to be actually actionable ways in which pushing human rights teams at big platforms to actually force them to make changes that respect digital rights. Thank you so much. This is a fantastic panel. Thank you, Amira, Mona, Rida, and thank you. I really appreciate what y'all brought to this panel.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
إلهي وامحو الحدود التي علبتني وشوهت وجه المدى. انصب لي خيمة عودتها داني بالي الواحة، شوية أعشاب وحجرين بدل قداحة. هل يا ترى العالم حينبع غيابنا؟ إلهي أعدني إلى الصحراء من فضلك. بلا آيفون حوالين النار مع ولدي قاعد بغني له لاسرياب، بروي له عن زمن غابر بلا ما يصلوا SMS عن أخبار فاضل شاكر. إلهي أعدني إلى الصحراء من فضلك. إلهي وقف دوران العالم، مش قادري أتحمل دخته بدي أنزل. إلهي وقف دوران العالم، مش قادري أتحمل دخته بدي أنزل.
في الغاب ما ليس فينا، يأكل الوحش وحشا إن جاع لا وحشين.
إلهي هب لي بلادا ملاذا
لا دين فيهم ويحيون في سلم كما ترى. أم ترى الليث يقتل من أجل مذهبه الطائفي ظبيا. يا إلهي
إلهي هب لي بلادا ملاذا. إلهي وقف دوران العالم، مش قادري أتحمل ضغطه، بدي أنزل. إلهي وقف دوران العالم، مش قادري أتحمل ضغطه، بدي أنزل.
ننتقل الآن إلى حوار مع الدكتورة تيمنيت غبرو، المؤسسة والرئيسة التنفيذية لمعهد البحوث في الذكاء الاصطناعي الموزع دير. ستحدثنا الدكتورة تيمنيت عن بعض الطرق التي تستخدم بها التكنولوجيا لإدامة الفصل العنصري والإبادة الجماعية، وستناقش الحركات التي تقاوم وترسم مستقبلاً تكنولوجياً مختلفاً.
We move now to our discussion with Dr. Tiemenit Gebru, the founder and CEO of the Distributed AI Research Institute. Dr. Gebru will talk about the methods by which technology is used to expand oppression and genocide, as well as discussing social movements working towards building a different digital future.
Should I go ahead?
Go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thank you everybody for having me. I'm really excited to be part of this conference. And I saw on the program that you've had a number of people talking about the harms of tech systems and how they've been used in Palestine in particular. So I don't want to be redundant. So maybe I will just kind of briefly touch on that and discuss some of the ways in which people have been resisting. So Silicon Valley, where I've been around for a while, we are told that tech is a magical force that's going to save the world. So if you see Sam Altman's tweets, he's always saying things like, quote, "I think AI is going to be the greatest force for economic empowerment and a lot of people getting rich we have ever seen." And one of the biggest VCs, venture capitalists, Mark Andreessen, wrote a techno manifesto, which I had the misfortune of reading, called "Why AI Will Save the World." And he said, "I even think AI is going to improve warfare when it has to happen, by reducing wartime death rates dramatically. Every war is characterized by terrible decisions made under intense pressure and with sharply limited information by very limited human leaders. Now, military commanders and political leaders will have AI advisors that will help them to make much better strategic and tactical decisions, minimizing risk, error, and unnecessary bloodshed." We know that this is the opposite of what is happening right now, right? So I believe November or December, wrote a letter, an open letter to be signed by people in what is called the Responsible AI community. So the title of the letter was "The Responsible AI Community in Solidarity with Gaza and the Palestinian People." And in this letter, we were discussing the ways in which tech was used to commit this genocide, apartheid, and occupation. And there was an article responding to this letter. And in this article, a computer science professor was quoted. So Yoav Goldberg, a professor at Bar Ilan University and research director at AI2 Israel, emphasized that many of the AI systems or surveillance systems described in the letter have likely saved countless Palestinian lives. This is the complete opposite of what is happening, right? In your earlier sessions, there was Antony Lowenstein, the author of the Palestine Laboratory, who talked about how Palestine is Israel's workshop, where an occupied nation on its doorstep provides millions of subjugated people as a laboratory for the most precise and successful methods of domination. Israel's NSO Group, developer of the Pegasus software found on phones of human rights activists worldwide, is the world's most successful cyber surveillance company and is the tip of the iceberg of this surging industry, which largely operates in the shadows with no public scrutiny. Israeli warfare and surveillance technology is a multi-billion-dollar industry led by companies like weapons and drones manufacturer Elbit Systems and NSO Group. And I know that in your prior sessions, you also had Matt Mahmoudi talking about facial recognition technology and how it restricts freedom of movement across checkpoints. And of course, there are also tools like Smart Shooter that automate killing by adding AI to automatic weapons at those checkpoints. We've also, contrary to the statement that AI is being used to minimize civilian casualties, we've also seen some horrific weapons, like they had these names Lavender and things, and the Gospel, that were actually exponentially maximizing civilian death tolls. One of the most dehumanizing things I heard was that Israeli soldiers are rewarded for the number of Palestinians they add to face recognition databases, with people getting days off or bonuses if they are in the unit that adds the most number of Palestinian faces. There are also drone snipers firing at targets around Gaza hospitals. One of the, again, most dystopian things that I saw or heard was these quadcopters that play sounds of women and children crying, so that if you go to help them, then they shoot at you. So, you know, these weapons are used to persecute people and kill people, and then people escape war and persecution that is enabled with these weapons, only to be met with the same weapons at borders when they're trying to flee, right? So borders are the biggest worldwide apartheid systems that have been normalized. If you want to read more about this, there's this great book called Resisting Borders and Technologies of Violence. So I want to talk a little bit about the places that I'm from, that I know, and how they're connected to what is happening in Palestine. So I was born and raised in Ethiopia, and I'm of Eritrean descent. In 2017, Eritrea came just after Syria for the number of refugee applicants in Europe. So keep in mind that Syria's population is probably 5 times more that of Eritrea. We don't know for sure because no one has done a census in Eritrea. Eritrea boasts the longest detained journalists in the world, has over 360 detention facilities. Many people are actually imprisoned in shipping containers. And so the temperature can be so hot that your skin gets attached to the container and stuck to the container. It's the only country in the world that has never had elections, has never instituted a constitution, has zero free press, parliament, no independent arm of government, except for the dictator Isaias Afwerki, who has ruled with impunity for 30 years, over 30 years. So we have one of the highest immigration rates in the world. And so these refugees encounter, like I said, the world's largest apartheid system, which we have normalized, the borders, the visas required to enter them. And how do we normalize these worldwide apartheid system? How do we enforce it? So here's an article, a report called Inside New Refugee Camp Like a Prison. Greece and other countries prioritize surveillance over human rights. In this report, they talk about all sorts of things like magnetic gates with kilometers, NATO's type security fences, smart software using motion detection algorithms, automated decision-making, biometrics, and unpiloted drones are increasingly controlling migration as states turn to unregulated technological intervention fueled by lucrative and privatized border industrial complex. Who is at the helm of this border industrial complex? Well, the same systems, the same organizations that are profiting off of Palestinian death and genocide, like Elbit Systems. So Elbit Systems of America, a subsidiary of the Israeli arms company, has built many what are called integrated fixed towers throughout southern Arizona. So in the US-Mexico border, same thing, right? The border industrial complex, a global apartheid system trying to reduce the number of refugees coming in. And so these systems that they have daytime, nighttime vision, thermal energy cameras that can see at a distance of up to 7.5 miles, as well as ground sweeping radar with a radius of nearly 13 miles. So the harms that are outlined above, the border industrial complex, etc., they have an extraordinary growth in the budgets for immigration and border policing, which have increased from 1.2 billion in 1990s to 25.2 billion in 2019. And this is a political choice, right? This is not an inevitable state of affairs. The US spends orders of magnitudes more on border policing tech and weapons than, for instance, reducing climate change, which is an actual existential risk to humanity. And again, this growth is a political choice rather than an inevitable state of affairs. So this is Eritrea, right? One of the places that I'm from. I want to tell you about another place. So I was born and raised in Ethiopia, and there is a region of state in Ethiopia in the northern state of Tigray. Tigray has been undergoing a genocide since 2020. So there was a war that was declared on November 4, 2020. And I want to ask, I want you to reflect if you have ever heard about this war on the news. So the genocide in Tigray is the deadliest war of the 21st century, killing an estimated 800,000 people, which I believe is actually an underestimate. I believe at least double that amount of people have died, with over 100,000 women being victims of rape as a weapon of war. And now there is a famine induced by the genocide. So we talked about social media in the past session and how it is used to silence Palestinian voices as well as spread genocidal language. And I want to give you a brief excerpt of a social media post that I was really worried about. It was like a call to commit genocide. It says, "The war is with the person who grew up with you, your neighbor, but is favoring his own race and waiting for your death with hatred of your people. If you can clear and control these thorns and insects in the forest, victory is yours, and you need to do it now. Only if you're fast, you can save your people from embarrassment. Speed up and do it now." So they were telling people to commit genocide now. Go to your neighbor and kill them now, even if you feel bad. This post, Facebook responded saying that it didn't violate its terms, and it removed the post 18 hours later after reporters called to ask why it didn't violate their terms of service. So just like what's happening in Palestine, they let genocidal language go rampant and victims are silent. And this bias is even built into machine translation technology, right? In 2017, a Palestinian man wrote "Good morning," which was translated to "attack them." And he was arrested, but later released earlier. I don't want to know what would have happened to this person if it was now. And I want to let you know that Israeli drones were also among the weapons used to commit the genocide of Tigray. So, Anthony Lowenstein says the Abraham records were an arms deal, right? Every despot in the world is clamoring to get Israeli weapons to use against their own people to build electronic border walls, or, against their own people, or to build electronic border walls. So it is a little case of, the saying, none of us is free until all of us is free. So what are you doing? What should we do? What are people doing? The thing that has really been moving the needle is collective action, right? The first thing students are doing is stop universities from being military contractors. These are supposed to be a place of education. There was an article called an opinion editorial by MIT saying that MIT and other universities have to explicitly acknowledge their histories with contributions to human suffering and international conflicts. I don't know if you know that MIT was responsible for the founding of Raytheon, which is either the first or second weapons manufacturer's company. Stop universities from being hedge funds. If you go to tahrir.org//why-divest, so it's the Tahrir Coalition, they did this study that showed that out of University of Michigan's $23 billion endowment, 62% was in high-risk investments connected to weapons manufacturers and the Israeli state. And these people are working on open source tools to enable others to do the same analysis. And these students all over the world, let me say particularly in the US, have been suspended. They've lost jobs. They've been stopped from graduating. They've been beaten by police. They've been sprayed with the skunk water that is used against Palestinian neighborhoods. The whole weight of the state and billionaires, like the billionaires who are trying to bribe Mayor Eric Adams of NYC to call the police on Columbia students, is coming down on these students. So the whole weight of the system is coming down on these students. The second thing we need to do is stop big tech companies from being complicit in genocide, apartheid, and occupation. So, Polaroid workers did this in the US, and they started the first divestment movement against apartheid South Africa. And now Google and Amazon workers are revolting against Project Nimbus, and Google just fired 50 plus workers for protesting. Google and Amazon are in the business of making Israeli apartheid more efficient, violent, and deadly, right? They are providing the government with $1.2 billion worth of cloud compute infrastructure. And we should say we will not take money from war profiteers. Supporting the students and the people who are getting fired is really important, because we need to build power and change the tide, right? So supporting these people locally, I think, is really important. While we should avoid tech solutionism, I think we can still use our skills to put data in the hands of marginalized communities. So, for example, the organization Forensic Architecture used synthetic images generated from 3D software to train machine learning classifiers that classified images with tear gas grenades. So this allowed them to identify the use of what were called triple chaser tear gas grenades against civilians. And they created an open source tool to help other human rights-based organizations to do similar types of investigations. So we can use our skills to do these kinds of things. There is no place too insignificant not to care about, right? I don't know how many of you heard of the country Eritrea before I mentioned it today. So there is no group of people that is too unimportant to care about, and it really is true. The existence of what is experimented in Palestine is exported worldwide. I gave you 2 examples of Eritrea or Tigray. And when we're silent about any of these places, whether it's Sudan or the Democratic Republic of Congo or Palestine or Tigray, it means that there is an existence of such a place. We're letting them have a proof of concept, basically, right? That it's possible to do this kind of thing in the world. And we need a world where doing this is impossible. That's the world we need to create. And so as, Ruha Benjamin says, as we're dismantling, so she says, remember to imagine and craft the worlds you cannot live out, as well as just as you dismantle the ones you cannot live within, right? Remember to imagine and craft the worlds you cannot live without, just as you dismantle the ones you cannot live within. So no one owns tech. We're technologists. Tech is not synonymous with building weapons and killing people. And we need to remember that we can have a future where the types of horrifying tech we're seeing in Palestine doesn't exist anywhere in the world. We can have a world where this doesn't exist anywhere. And so it's not inevitable to have this tech right now. And it is not inevitable for us to see and ignore horrific genocides. We can have a world where this is not possible. So I want to kind of take you back to, using our imagination, right? That things are not inevitable. And remember Ruha's quote again, remember to imagine and craft the worlds you cannot live without, just as you dismantle the worlds that you cannot live within. And with that, I will end my remarks. And again, thank you for having me at this conference.
اثبت مكانك هنا عنوانك ده الخوف بيخاف منك وضميرك عمره ما خانك اثبت مكانك ده نور الشمس راجع يا تموت وانت واقف يا تعيش وانت راكع